So I don't know, did that spark anything? Like gangs, queens?
Yeah. But I figured I'd do it chronologically, maybe.
Sure.
I work my way through. Okay. The person you're seeing on the screen is not really the person that you think you're seeing. It's a figment of your imagination. But my stories basically are very compact, and I'm going to try to unpack them as I go along. I'll try to do it chronologically. And maybe the way to start is I'm told that I was born on June 20th, 1941. There are other people who claim that I was born on a different date. It was actually 1940. I don't know which story to believe. Obviously in one story I'm a certain age, and another one I'm a year older. I don't think it really makes a big difference. But one of my first memories, and these stories are going to be taken kind of out of context, and may not make much sense for those that didn't actually live it, but I'll try to make some sense out of it. So the first thing I remember as a child, and this happened obviously during World War II, we were displaced. By that I mean the Russians bombed Lithuania, which is where my family and I were living. My mom, my older brother, Edward, my aunt. So because the Russians were bombing, we had to evacuate, and we traveled through Europe trying to escape, the bombing and the war that had begun. And so we wound up somewhere traveling through Poland, and eventually wound up being in Germany. And the only clear images I have in Germany, I couldn't even tell you the year, but it was during a war, so I might have been 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. A lot of bombings, being in the woods, not really living in a house, but having a pillow and a blanket where we would sleep, where I would sleep anyway. And eventually, I think what happened, and I'm kind of making this up because I can't imagine any other scenario that would account for this. The German soldiers eventually found us living in the woods, and they brought us to a camp. And I call it a camp only because there were barbed wiring all around. But it was a camp that really contained two different sides, or two different areas. One area was for the Jews, and the other area was for the non-Jews. So, right. And so the only separation between the two peoples was really another set of barbed wire fencing. And so what makes me think that there was a separation by Jews and non-Jews? Well, the Jews had to wear a certain emblem on their clothing, and the people that were on my side didn't have one of those, and so we were non-Jews, but we were enemies of the Third Reich. Why, I'm not exactly sure, but could have been something to do with my mother's politics and the fact that she was an anti-Nazi individual and made no secret of it. So I made friends with some of the kids on the other side of the barbed wire fence, and that went on for a while. I don't remember much other than the fact that there was really no food, and you could hear a lot of crying and screaming in the middle of the night. And I was always unsure what was really going on. And then the next thing that I remember is being put on a train, basically a cattle car, with my mom and my brother Eddie and my aunt. And we traveled for a couple of days and a couple of nights, and finally wound up in a part of Germany, I don't even know where. But we were then brought to a farm in Germany. And it turned out to be a farm owned by the Millers. And the Millers was the mother, the father, 4 sons, 1 daughter that I remember. I could be off on the details, but that's kind of how I remember it. And so our job, you probably figured out where I was going with this. We were basically slave labor at that point. So our assignment to the farm was not for rest and relaxation. It was to help work the farm. And by that I mean feed the chickens and milk the cows and, take care of the hayloft and everything else. And so I'm trying to remember how old I might have been, maybe 2.5, maybe 3 years old, something like that. The war had not ended yet. How do I know that? Because the father and the 4 sons, I would see them, sitting at the kitchen table eating, and occasionally we would see tiny silver specks in the sky. Those were bombers, probably a combination of British and American, heading for some large city in Germany to bomb the hell out of it. And the reason I'm talking a little funny is I've had oral surgery, so excuse my talking like Daffy Duck. And so the routine was the family would, sit down for breakfast. There weren't 3 meals a day, as I remember. It was more like 1.5 meals per day. And so the Miller family would sit down and eat, and there really wasn't much on the table to eat. But whatever there was, at the end of their mealtime, they would take the leftovers from each of the plates and put it into a common bowl. And that's when we would be allowed to come and sit at the table after the Millers had left the table. And if there were any leftovers, we had, our share of the leftovers. And my mom would always make sure that, we all got some kind of a share. And that went on for a while. And then I noticed little by little that each of the sons would disappear. They were no longer around. And then the father disappeared at some point. And being young, I didn't really know what was going on, but, I realized pretty soon that they were in the army. They had to leave the farm and join the German army. And times were really tough, because now there was only Mrs. Miller and her young daughter, who was maybe 6 months older than I was. I'm guessing at that point, but she was a little older. And it was the same routine. They would eat first, and if there were any leftovers on their plates, we would get it and we would split it. If there weren't any leftovers, well, tough nuggies. That was just it. We were on our own. And then Mrs. Miller was okay, I think, except for the chocolate bar caper that kind of put things in perspective for me. And the little girl, I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. All I remember about her, she had blonde hair, long braids, and she had a Hershey bar, and she would taunt me with it, because clearly she was taught or realized that she was in charge and that we were basically nothing more than peasants, servants. And so she could taunt me with the bar, and she would wave the bar in front of me. And I recall basically her describing the bar to me as, I have a chocolate bar and you don't. That kind of stupid stuff. And I really wasn't envious of it. I really didn't care. I didn't even know what a chocolate bar was. So it meant nothing to me. Where she got it from, I don't know. But she would have a special hiding place. And then one day, Mrs. Miller walked into the kitchen table area where we were and grabbed me by the scruff of my neck and started slapping me around. And it turned out that the little girl told her mom that I had stolen her chocolate bar and that I had eaten it. And that she knew I'd eaten it because she found chocolate around my lips. And of course, my mother was furious at the time. I, of course, had no idea what the hell was going on. And finally, it came down to the search for the chocolate bar. So Mrs. Miller was still slapping me around, and she prepared this big metal bucket that typically you would bathe a child in, filled it with water. And because I wouldn't confess to having stolen the bar, and worse, eating it, my punishment was that my head would be held underwater for as long as Mrs. Miller thought it was appropriate, until I finally confessed. Well, there was no confession forthcoming, because I wasn't about to confess to something I hadn't done. And so that went on for a while. And I remember swallowing quite a bit of water. I remember finally my mother just being furious, jumping up and pulling Mrs. Miller away from me and yelling at her, which was kind of dangerous because, I mean, we were prisoners of war, basically, not German. So we could have been severely punished, especially since I had stolen a German kid's chocolate bar, which was a prized treasure for her. And life went on. I was kind of forgiven, I guess, for stealing the chocolate bar. And can't remember how much time had passed. Probably not too much. The chocolate bar was finally discovered. Apparently the little girl had put it in a drawer, a dresser drawer, that had fallen behind a drawer underneath Mrs. Miller in the process of cleaning it. The area, cleaning the little girl's room, eventually found a chocolate bar. And while there was no expression of sorrow on her part, it was pretty clear that she recognized that she overreacted and kind of made a half-hearted apology to the chocolate thief. That's me. Saying that, she really regrets some of the actions that she took, but, the chocolate bar was near and dear to her daughter, and she had to protect her daughter, and, I don't remember how I reacted one way or the other, but I thought in the end maybe the little girl would share some of the chocolate with me because of what they had put me through, but they didn't. And I don't really know what happened to the chocolate bar, assuming the little kid ate it and probably enjoyed every morsel of it. So that story kind of fits into a longer narrative about being basically a prisoner, a slave labor in a German household. All right. The next chapter is kind of a sequel to the chocolate bar story. The reason I say it's a sequel is because I have no idea what the hell happened or what might have happened in between. But in my memory bank, it's a sequel. I told you that Mrs. Miller had 4 sons, as well as a husband. As it turned out, and I think before the chocolate was actually discovered by the little girl, all of her sons were killed in a war. She got notice. And her husband was also killed. I remember Mrs. Miller crying out loud, to a point where I think we all felt very, very sorry for her. Didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. It was a human tragedy. Didn't matter if they were Germans or not. Back in those days during the war, I mean, we certainly didn't think of people in terms of their nationality. They were just, human beings. And so when Mrs. Miller kind of apologized to me for nearly drowning me, which I don't think she would have, but I felt that I came pretty damn close to it. And by the way, to this day, I don't like the water. I don't go into swimming pools. I just have an aversion to it. And so, eating at the table, the kitchen table, became the same kind of ritual. I think I mentioned that before. And it must have been during the latter part of the war, as time went on. Bombers came over that particular night, and some city near the village where we were was being bombed. And a couple of the bombers were shot down. And there was one airman that parachuted down and landed near the farm area where we were. And I was awake because there was a hell of a large noise outside, and I think it was the anti-aircraft guns or whatever they were. So my mom didn't know this, but I kind of snuck outside to watch what was going on. And I could see, the searchlights hitting the planes. And I could see one of the parachutes coming down right by the farmland. And maybe I was 3 years old at the time, maybe 3.5. And I see the parachute hit the ground. And the airman that was in the parachute shed the parachute and was sprinting along. And I waved to him. I don't know why, but I did. And because I knew instinctively that he wasn't a bad guy. I don't know how I knew, but you just know these things. And so he must have been terrified, because I was terrified. So I'm kind of putting it on him that he too must have been terrified. All I spoke was German at the time, and I think all he spoke was English. He was probably a Southerner, because I remember there's a certain twang, a certain drawl to his language, which I later found out was, English, American, Southern. And so I knew he was in trouble. And so I motioned him to follow me and got him into the house. And he was very reluctant to do that because he didn't know me. He didn't know who I was. He had no idea that I was also a prisoner. And I could tell he was afraid. And so you'll hear more about another part of the story about the root cellar. And so I knew that I had to hide him because the Germans and their dogs were nearby. I could hear the dogs. And so I hid him in the root cellar. And I would steal food. I would take my share of what was left over from the meals. I remember at that point, I think there was only one meal per day, if you could even call it a meal. So I would secretly hide my portion to make sure that, my mother didn't see it, and my aunt didn't see it, and my brother didn't see it, because they would immediately ask, "What are you doing? How come you're not eating?" And so I would somehow hide it. I don't remember how I would, but I would bring it down to the root cellar for the airman, which I subsequently determined was an American. And maybe 3-4 days had passed. And then the German patrols with their dogs, were coming house by house because other people had reported seeing a parachutist landing. And they needed to find whoever this person was. And the dogs were barking very loudly, I remember that. And the patrol must have approached the farm, and the soldier must have become panicked, and he bolted out of the root cellar, and he started running across the field. And I remember seeing the German patrol raise their rifles and they shot him. Not at close range, but close enough. I can't even begin to estimate how far away distance he was from the patrol, but they killed him. And so more German officers then showed up in their jeeps and their trucks, and they lined up Mrs. Miller and her daughter and, you know, my family, and they began to question us. And the German Mrs. Miller explained to them who she was and who we were, and the Germans were convinced that somehow I had something to do with hiding this American. And so they were roughing me up. I know it sounds crazy because I couldn't have been more than 3.5 years old at the time, but they did. They were kind of slapping me around a little bit and threatening that, you know, they would do things to my family unless I confessed. And I remember Mrs. Miller jumping in, and I was really shocked and protecting me. And I did speak German at the time. Don't ask me how or why, but I did. And I understood German. I spoke German. And I remember her saying, "What is wrong with you people? He's just a little boy. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't even want to be here. How could a little boy like that do what you're accusing him of doing? What is wrong with you people?" Something along those lines. And then eventually the Germans left. And I remember my mother quietly asking me later, did I know about the American soldier, you know, hiding in a house? And of course I didn't tell her because I was afraid that somehow she'd give it away, you know, by her expressions on her face or something that she would say. So even as a kid, I knew, keep my mouth shut, you know, don't say anything. But sometime right around here, I kind of figured out who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and I wasn't quite sure what the differences were, but I knew deep inside the Germans were bad. I hate to say this because I know this is being recorded, but so that was pretty much, you know, the end of that particular segment. And life on the farm became a little bit better. We started to get better rations from Mrs. Miller after that. And then my mother explained to me when there weren't any rations, how in fact she was able to secure rations. So the next sequel to the story has to do with my mom stealing food for us. And so I didn't tell you at the very beginning, but I'll tell you now, my mother was a master seamstress. And by that I mean she didn't need anything to make a dress or a suit or anything like that. She could just look at a person, immediately figure out the sizes in her head, and basically make anything she wanted to make out of cloth. And so we found out where Mrs. Miller hid the bread. And the bread that I'm talking about were these huge, huge round loaves of black bread, because she had basically an oven outside the house where she could make the dough and had enough material, she would make the bread. But Mrs. Miller would mark up the bread in a way that she knew if somebody cut a slice, okay, she would use pins somehow and contour the bread with the pins as she put it up in the attic, so that she knew the next morning if any of the bread was missing. My mother figured out the routine that Mrs. Miller was using. So my mother every night would sneak up to the attic, take a sharp knife with her, remove the pins and make a slice into the bread, and then replace the pins virtually in similar spots to where Mrs. Miller put the pins. And we were never found out. But that bread kept us alive, and it was more than Mrs. Miller and her daughter could possibly eat. So I found out how to steal food. And I remember being very impressed with my mother that she was able to figure out, the routine that Mrs. Miller used. And I don't know what that education did for me later, but I probably could have made a real good thief if I wanted to be a thief, which I wasn't. But that's beside the point. So that's kind of the story of the bread thieves, us, and surviving in the midst of really not having enough food. We knew that Mrs. Miller, would be okay. She had enough food. But times are tough in war, and she has to take care of herself and her daughter first. I kind of understood that even back then. But so the next sequel, I told you times got a little bit better. The next sequel really has to do with the end of the war. So we're still living at the Miller farm, and things were not great, but they were okay. And my job was to feed the pigs, and I would feed them slop. To this day, I can't eat certain foods because they remind you of the slop that I used to feed the pigs with. So I can't eat yogurt. But I'll eat sour cream because it's pure. But yogurt has things in it that kind of remind me of the slop. But anyway, people during the war became very creative. And while there weren't any telephones, some kind of communication system was in place where one village could somehow relay information to the next village. Or maybe it was Germans on bicycles that rode real fast and brought news of, what's happening in the village next door. And so word came down that the Russians were coming village by village using trucks and taking people like ourselves, prisoners of war, because they considered us to be Russian citizens. Now, were we? No, but they declared it so, and therefore it was. So the Russians had taken over Lithuania, and anybody that might have come from Lithuania was considered to have been born there was also a Russian citizen. And so there was panic. The Germans hated the Russians hated the Germans, and the Russians hated anybody that deserted their country and basically deserted Russia. So while we were non-Germans, we were hated nevertheless. And so the Russians pulled into the farm. I remember there were 3 trucks. I guess you call them deuce and a half, 2.5 ton trucks, with soldiers in the back. And 2 more trucks arrived, and they were American trucks. And how do I know that? Because I saw the American insignias on the trucks. And the Americans were working in concert with the Russians. And I obviously didn't understand politics back then, but the Russians had a manifest of everyone who was living on Mrs. Miller's farm. How many there were, our ages, and they explained to Mrs. Miller in German, because I understood German, but I've told you that before, that they were looking for us. And they were going to take us back to our mother country, which we, of course, knew was going to be the Gulag. And how did we know that? We knew that from other villages that they had gone to, and the people had disappeared. And in one of the villages, the prisoners of war went to their local church, and they barricaded themselves inside the church rather than being taken by the Russians. and the Russians burned the church to the ground, including the people that were inside. There were over 200 of them. We had gotten word, what the Russians had done. And so we knew that whatever they had planned for us was not a vacation spot anywhere. And so we really didn't know what to do. But Mrs. Miller decided that before the Russians came, that she was going to hide us. And so we could overhear what was going on, outside of the house. Mrs. Miller put us in the same root cellar where I had the American airmen. And the Russians and the Americans tore the house apart. They went upstairs into the bedrooms. They went into the barns. They tore everything around. Mrs. Miller finally told them that we had escaped quite some time back, and that she had reported our escape to the Burgermeister, who, I guess the loose translation would be the local mayor. And of course, Mrs. Miller knew that the local mayor had been killed in a bombing raid, so he wouldn't make a good witness. So the Russians and the Americans finally left, and we came out of hiding, and my mother and Mrs. Miller, hugged one another, and I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. Mrs. Miller was just so mean. Why would she do something like that? Because that would have meant certain death to her had the Russians found out, because the Russians had no love for any of the Germans, and she would have been shot on sight. But be that as it may, I don't exactly remember what happened after that, but we knew that Mrs. Miller was on her own with her daughter. And so my mother decided that it was time for us to leave, because had the Russians discovered that we were still at the farm, things would have gone very, very badly for Mrs. Miller. And so we left the farm. I remember we traveled by foot, and we wound up in some other German village, but it was a much larger village than Mrs. Miller's farm. And that was the last time we saw Mrs. Miller, except for, I'm going to jump ahead, except for my mother, who continued to communicate with Mrs. Miller. And even when we came to the United States, in another segment I'll tell you how that happened, my mother, after the war, found a job in an American factory in Germany making uniforms, for the soldiers. And so she earned fairly decent money and a lot of cigarettes. Cigarettes were basically currency at the time. So you could trade the cigarettes in for anything you wanted. Food, trip to the opera, whatever you wanted to do. Cigarettes were king. And so my mother would send money to Mrs. Miller every week. And I could never figure out why. And it wasn't until we came to the United States and sending the money continued, and it finally meshed in my brain why my mother was sending Mrs. Miller money. But that said, unless you want me to tell the story about how we got to the States. Okay, so this segue I'll call the rhubarb caper. Yeah, all right. So this is right after World War II, and we found our way into another part of Germany after we got out of Mrs. Miller's farm, and it was a displaced persons camp. Now, for those of you that may not know what that is, it's nothing more than refugees that were in a foreign country, in this case Germany. Refugees had to be placed into a displaced persons camp because you just couldn't let them run around loose. And so the camp was not so much barbed wire as more of think of a condominium complex. A small C in a condominium. Quadrangle in shape. And each side had a nationality that was housed. So in this particular case, the displaced persons camp that we were in, one side had Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians. Another side might have had Romanians, Russians, something else. You kind of get the picture. And so at the time, it's after the war, and I had contracted tuberculosis during the war. And so immediately afterwards, I was sent to a hospital in Germany because they didn't think I was going to survive. And so I was at the hospital for maybe 2 years, something like that, high up in the mountains in a place called Augsburg. And so I finally got out of the hospital. I was released, but I really wasn't allowed to do anything. I couldn't really run. I couldn't exert myself because my lungs were shot. And so I learned how to cope without actually being part of a gang, if you know what I mean, a gang of kids. And so they didn't know why I really didn't run and play with them, but I would find an excuse of why not. But, we continued to be hungry. And so part of what we as, the kid gang would do was try to figure out where we could steal food. Stealing food became, an art form for us. And so we knew that the Germans were still allowed to grow vegetables and stuff. We displaced people were not allowed to do any of that crap. And so we couldn't even keep animals. However, outside of the quadrangle area, there was one street where the Germans were living, and they were growing fruits and vegetables, and I was particularly fond of a certain vegetable called rhubarb. And I spotted rhubarb being grown behind a metal fence. Metal like with spikes on the top. Very, very common here in the States. And so one day I rounded up several of the kids, roughly my age, some older, some younger. And we decided we were going to go on a rhubarb raid and bring rhubarb home to our families and become heroes. I mean, how could you not be a hero after you bring rhubarb home? And so we laid out a plan, and we were going to sneak across the street because we really weren't confined to the displaced persons camp. And we would jump the fence and very stealthily go through and pluck the rhubarb and shove them in our shirts, then jump back over the fence and get back home and become instant heroes. Well, it didn't exactly work out that way. Because as soon as we jumped the fence, we noticed that one of the houses near the rhubarb field had French doors. And while the French doors had a curtain, it was a sheer curtain, and it was actually a beautiful sunny day. And what we didn't know was that there were some young women living in that particular apartment, which was on ground floor, behind the sheer curtains, and they were sunbathing in the nude. Now you have to remember, we were 6, 7 years old. Our understanding of, that kind of stuff was nil to non-existent. And so we're looking at the rhubarb, we're looking at the naked ladies, at the rhubarb, the naked ladies. And we decided that the naked ladies perhaps needed a bit more attention from us than the rhubarb. And so one of the other young guys that was with us apparently got to a point where he couldn't contain himself and yelled something out. I don't remember what he yelled out. Like, could have been, "Oh my God," or something like that. And we were discovered by the German young ladies. They began to scream. They threw on some clothes, threw open the French doors, screaming at the top of their lungs. And we didn't know whether we grab our rhubarb or drop the rhubarb and run or what. We decided to try to run with the rhubarb and jump back over the fence. So as we're trying to jump back over the fence, most of us made it. We got to about the middle of the street when the German police finally showed up and grabbed us. And the townspeople from the, what we call the Lagedi, that's a term for the displaced persons camp. All it means is like a stalag. So those people had formed and they could see what was going on. They could see the German police grabbing us and pulling us into vans that are pulled up. And they were furious. And they ran out in the street and they started tugging at us. And of course we were putting up hooping and hollering all over the place. Don't know why. I mean, we were thieves, so, I don't know what course of action, we had any right to. And the young women were still yelling and screaming. And eventually American jeeps pulled up because we were in the American sector of the displaced persons camp. And then the Brits showed up and some French jeeps showed up. And the German police figured out this is a battle that they're not going to win. At least I'm guessing that's really what happened. And so we were finally pulled away from the German police. Rhubarb intact inside of our shirts. Not everybody. Some lost the rhubarb on their escape route. But I had rhubarb in my shirt. And so came home the victorious soldier with rhubarb inside my shirt to feed the family. And to this day, I love rhubarb. Cut off the end, you take some of the skin off, you dip it into sugar. Of course, we didn't have sugar back in those days, but you can imagine. Dip it in sugar, you bite into it. Delicious. Anyway, that's the rhubarb caper.
You didn't have sugar.
Eventually we got sugar.
Yeah.
And that made it so much sweeter.
Yeah.
So, that's the rhubarb caper. So some of you are probably wondering, wait a minute, this kid's, I think he said he might have been 7 years old. So obviously he should know right from wrong. Yeah, I did. But the rhubarb was just too tempting. But why isn't he in school? Well, I never went to school, at least not in Germany. Don't know why, but there really weren't any schools. So first school I ever went to was actually in Brooklyn, New York, once we got here. So how did we get here? Kind of a crazy story. I think I told you earlier that I developed tuberculosis and I really wasn't allowed to exert myself in any way. And so part of what I used to do when the other kids were running around playing games, and I wasn't stealing rhubarb by jumping fences, I would spend my time in this burnt out church, bombed out church, I should say. And it was a quiet place, and the kids didn't find me there. They never looked, never bothered to look. Who would think that, some 7-year-old kid would be spending time inside of a bombed out church? But the church basically had, I'd say 2.5 standing walls. It had no roof. It still had a priest in there, but that was pretty much it. So I would hang around in the back, and it was nothing than, piles of rubble, wood, and bricks. And so finally, the priest came over to me, and again in German, wanted to know if I'd be willing to do some chores for him. And the chores were cleaning up the church. Now you could imagine there was nothing to clean up. But I think he felt sorry for me. And I thought I had a real job. I'd finally made it. I mean, I was a practiced rhubarb thief. So, it was time for the big time for me. I could probably get a job. And so my job would be as a janitor in a church. And so I would show up every morning and move a couple of bricks around here and there, and, pretending that I was cleaning the church, and he would pretend that he was, very appreciative. And that went on for a while, and my mother never knew, really where I spent my days. And that went on for a while, and finally, the priest called me into his rectory, call it his rectory, his little alcove, amongst piles of bricks, and told me that he'll be leaving. He's going to be going far away, but I shouldn't worry. We'll be seeing one another again soon. And I remember crying my eyes out because he was really nice to me. Always, protected me and brought me little things every now and again to munch on. And so the next thing I knew, he vanished. I found out later that he came to America, actually to New Jersey. Don't remember the exact name of the town. I remember it at some point. But I continued to go to the church, continue to clean it, because I promised that was my job, and, I wasn't about to let him down, even though he was no longer there. And then one day, my mother receives this very large envelope in the mail. And she looks at it, and of course has no idea who it's from, opens it up, and it turns out it's from the priest. My mother knew nothing about him, started asking me questions, and I said, oh yeah, I used to work at the church and, do this and do that. The priest had basically sponsored my mother, my older brother, and myself to come to the United States. She found people that were willing to sponsor us. By that, I mean basically bond by word that financially they would take care of us, that give us a place, to live. And so I remember my mother just falling down to the ground and yelling and screaming out of gratitude, out of happiness that such a thing happened. It was very unusual. Very few people ever got sponsored, but we were lucky enough to have been sponsored. My aunt, in the meantime, had already been sponsored to go to Canada because the man that she was dating was a physician, and he sponsored her. So, the family would not really be separated. She had a safe place to go, and we thought we would probably wind up in Australia at some point because the Australians were taking just about anybody, but the Americans were not. And we had to pass muster. And so there was no way that I could have come to the States because I could never have passed the medical test because I was in a sanitarium. I had tuberculosis. And if you had tuberculosis, the Americans would not allow you into their country. Well, it turned out my uncle, my aunt's future husband, worked in a local hospital in Germany. And he had access to medical records. And so he switched my x-rays with some other kid roughly my age that didn't have tuberculosis. and clearly was not destined to come to the States. He was a German kid. And because he had switched the x-rays, the Americans who were going through all the documentation did not figure out that those x-rays did not belong to me. And so we finally were cleared to come to the States. We boarded the ship, the USS General Hershey, and eventually it came to the States. And we were met in Brooklyn, New York, at the docks by the priest who had brought a bag of fruit for all of us. And at the top of the bag of fruit was a banana. I'd never seen a banana in my entire life. I knew what an orange was. I'd seen that. I knew what an apple was. I knew what a pear was, but not a banana. So he was watching me watching the banana, and I could still remember the twinkle in his eye. And I remember in German, he was saying to me, would you like some? And I figured, yeah, this is America. Whatever that is, I'd like some. So he took the banana out of the top of the bag and he gave it to me. I did not realize you had to peel the banana. And so I bit into it. And I made this noise like, oh my God, how horrible. And I remember he laughed his sides out. He thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Everybody else was laughing too, but I don't know why, because they didn't know any better than I did. And bottom line to that story is he died of cancer 6 months later. So he knew he had cancer. And he was a man who truly believed what he believed. And to this day, I remember him. And he did not have to do what he did, but he did out of the goodness of his heart. So there are people in this world who were like that. So anyway, that's the coming to America story. But then there's another part to the story about my older brother, Eddie, which I'll tell now. In order to come to the States, and my mother was a master seamstress, and she had certificate papers from the Americans that said she was a master seamstress, which she was. But my brother was 15 years old at the time, and if you're 15, you have to have a trade, some kind of a certificate that says you can make a living once you're here in the States. And so, what I haven't told you so far is that my brother Edward was mentally retarded. The kindest, nicest person I think you'd ever want to run across. But he was mentally retarded. He had maybe a mental age of about 6.5, 7 years old. So he didn't have a trade. So my mother, anticipating that one day we were going to, wind up going to Australia as opposed to the United States, made a deal with the local barber in a German town where the displaced person's camp was. And the deal with the barber was, the barber had a wife who had a champagne taste and but didn't really have the funds to buy any champagne. And so she liked to party. And the barber was a man of no means, really, but he loved his wife. And so my mother made a deal with the barber, my mother being a master seamstress, that my mother would make the barber's wife 3 gowns, outstanding gowns. And what the barber would do would be to train my older brother Eddie in the art of barbering and in the art of, tonsorial excellence. And so every morning my brother would set out to go to the barber school. And it became very clear to the barber after the first day that my older brother was incapable of ever capturing the art of being a barber or captured the art of a straight razor being used to shave, or cutting someone's hair. So the barber, being no fool, figured he had to deal with my mom about 3 party dresses for his wife. And who the hell would know the difference anyway? It was the only certificate that he had to sign. And so my brother's job at the barbershop became sweeping the barbershop. So my brother became a great sweeper. I don't think there was a better sweeper than my brother Eddie, ever. But he didn't know diddly squat about cutting hair or shaving anybody. And so 6 months passed, which was the extent of the certificate. And the barber got this fancy looking certificate that my brother Edward had mastered the art of being a barber. And with that, we were allowed to emigrate to the United States, and the United States people that would review the documents found everything in order. My brother was a great barber, tonsorial artist, and my mother was fantastic. She had something from the Americans. She was a master seamstress, and I was just a stupid kid, so I didn't have to have any skill sets. So here we are in Bremerhaven in Germany, boarding the USS General Hershey. And people would line up, and of course they had a master list of who was coming on board and what the skill sets were. And there are about 750 passengers that were taken off. Do you want to take a guess at the one skill set that they were lacking, and there was only one person on the entire manifest that had that skill? Yep, you guessed it. It was my brother Edward. And so the ship's officers set up a tonsorial parlor in the front of the boat, the fore of the boat. Women were lined up on one side of the rails and men on the other. And they would be herded into the tonsorial parlor where my older brother was wielding a straight edge razor, long pointy scissors, a brush, and a large comb. And after about 3 or 4 men had gone through and had come out in various stages of disrepair, half the heads, hair missing, cut faces, screams from the officers, the captain decided that my brother should be arrested and taken to the brig. Obviously a fraud. And so they arrested him and they took him to the brig. So we're all waiting for Eddie to come back for his first successful day as a barber on board the USS General Hershey, but he doesn't come home. Now home is a part of the ship. Everybody is sleeping in hammocks. Hammocks were, I think, 3 high. No privacy whatsoever. And so he doesn't come home. And so my mother gets hysterical. And so she rounds up some of the other people, including myself, and goes to see the captain. And knocks on the door, and obviously we were escorted there by some of the officers, and announces that my brother is lost, obviously had fallen overboard. And she wants the captain to stop the ship, turn it around, and do a rescue search for my brother Edward. Now, we had just passed the English Channel at that point, and for those of you that have never passed through the English Channel, it's like falling into a crater. Very rough waters. Everybody was seasick. And of course, the captain refused to turn the ship around. And that was just the end of that. So we all came back to our little areas, and I don't think any of us really slept through the night. Everybody's crying and carrying on. And poor Edward lost at sea. And then one of the women, I forgot what nationality she was, comes running over to my mother and in German says, Mrs., I saw your son. And my mother is delirious at this point and thinks that Edward's apparitions had somehow showed up on board the ship. And my mother says, "Where did you see my son?" And the woman says, "He's in the kitchen. He's working in the kitchen." So about 50 people stampede into the kitchen. And we don't see anything. But then we see this guy laboring behind a machine. And they had put Edward to work as cleaning potatoes, peeling potatoes. But a machine was assisting him, some kind of a tumbler inside that would take some of the stuff off. And he had a big smile on his face. You know, he finally had a real job that he was good at. And the captain apparently didn't really know his name, didn't really care what his name was. Did not connect my mother and, you know, the band behind her with the missing kid. He decided, you know, rather than putting this guy in jail in the brig, why don't we just put him to work? And so Eddie became the potato peeler for the remainder of the ship, which landed in Brooklyn, New York. And that's the end of the stories for tonight. Sleep well, kids.